do was scoot you forward so we can just feel a little bit closer to each other. Although you're probably going to hate me after this review. I hate me after this review. I'm not even done with this review and I hate me. I am in a reading slump. I don't know what's wrong with me. Maybe I just don't know what's wrong with the literary world, but I cannot seem to find a book that I like. I actually have been pining for Harry Potter. And if you saw my Harry Potter reviews, you know that I told myself I was going to have to take a break from Harry Potter because it was rough having to review my favorite series. But today's book, The Wish by Nicholas Sparks, I had really high expectations because he's Nicholas Sparks, for Pete's sake. I didn't even get that far into it before I said, this is Nicholas Sparks. Honestly, it felt like best-selling complacency. Like, he didn't even try because he didn't have to try. And it made me want to reread his other books, like maybe The Notebook or something, to see if he's always been this bad. It's not even a cliche, because I knew going into it, there was going to be a romance and there were going to be a lot of cheesy elements because that's kind of what he does. But I think what humanizes and excuses his cheesy elements is the way he humanizes things, like the problems that he includes and the way that his characters feel like real people. And this one, I think the problem was there was no story. It was all telling. We had very few scenes in which we were shown something. We had very little dialogue. A lot of it was this happened and this happened and this happened, and it's incredibly unengaging when you don't actually get to experience the story, when all you're doing is reliving it through what somebody else is remembering. The irony of that is that's essentially what a story is someone telling you what's happening. Especially when, like with Nicholas Sparks, he's writing in the past tense. So we're essentially going through a story through somebody's memory. So it shouldn't have been a problem, but it was. I actually was reading a review that I didn't understand at first, but in retrospect, I completely agree. And what this person said was that The Wish, it was boring because it was just giving us the day-to-day of the character's life. I was like, I'm not really seeing that. And I think what they meant, it wasn't like I woke up and I had breakfast and then I watched TV. It was like, well, this is what happened on this day, and then this is what happened on this day, and then this is what happened on this day. Instead of being like, all right, so now we're on Monday, and watch me walk through my day. It was walking us through days without showing us what was happening in those days. I just kept expecting for it to end, for that to maybe be the beginning, and then we build into a story, and it never happened. And the one thing in particular that I kept expecting to happen was the main character, Maggie, started referencing the storm. So I didn't know if the storm was a metaphor, or if it was literal, or maybe it was literal and a metaphor. It turned out to be literal. But did we see the storm? Absolutely not. We heard that the storm was coming, and they were being literal, that a literal storm was coming. We saw people boarding up their houses and getting generators and essentially just preparing for it. And then the storm hits, but we don't see it. We just see the next day, and she's like, well, yeah, like trees were down, and now everybody's taking the boards off their windows. I was expecting that to be the midpoint, that to be this big moment where something happens and there's a life-changing event. And it wasn't life-changing. I was just so disappointed, and I expected so much more from Nicholas Sparks. Let's move on to what The Wish is actually about. It is about Maggie, who we have two time streams with her. We have one in the present and one in the past. In the present, we learn that she's a successful photographer who has discovered that she has terminal cancer. She has hired this guy named Mark to work in the gallery. She's essentially preparing to die, which I'll get into that more later if I remember. And then Christmas comes. Everybody leaves but her and Mark. She is gifted tickets to a show. She decides to take Mark with her. She starts to tell him her story because he asks about her love life. Like, was there ever a one? And she says, well, there was, but it just wasn't the right time. Obviously, he wants an elaboration, which is when we flip back to her as a teenager, and we learn that she had gotten pregnant at 15. I have another issue with that, but again, let's put a pin in it. When she gets pregnant, she is sent from her home in Seattle to Ocracoke in North Carolina to live with her significantly older aunt who used to be a nun, which there's another thing with that, but hopefully I'll remember that pin as well. While there, she meets this guy named Bryce. It's a very small island. Apparently, there are other people, like other young people there, but she hasn't met any of them. But Bryce knows her aunt, and so her aunt enlists Bryce to tutor Maggie because Maggie is failing miserably. 2 more pins, okay? Bryce as well as Maggie's schooling. They begin to form this relationship. She insists that she not necessarily doesn't have a libido, but she insists that she cannot feel romantic feelings towards boys anymore. Just in general, no romantic feelings towards another person. However, she is not immune to his good looks and his charm. We all know this is going to be the guy. The question is now, why didn't it work out, or why wasn't it the right time? They form this bond and she gets to know his family, kind of enriches her life and makes everything better with part of her family. Well, I should just say her aunt, not actually her family, which another pin. We get to the part where she has her kid. We catch back up with her in her present timeline, and huge spoiler here. I hope I'm not the only one who put this together, which is another pin. Guess who Mark is? He's the baby she gave up for adoption. That's kind of how we come full circle. We start with Maggie in the present, then we go to Maggie at 15, we come back to Maggie in the present, we go back to Maggie at 15, and then we end with Maggie in the present. There were no chapter delineations. Like, I had no clue when chapters began and ended. But my guesstimation is a good chapter and a half, maybe 2, happened without a single bit of dialogue, without a single bit of scene. It started with Maggie walking to work and telling us how she became a photographer, telling us how she got to her current professional station. It took me a minute to figure out what was going on. And it took me a minute to figure out what was wrong. Like, you know, that itch at the back of your head where you're like, something's not quite right. I don't quite find myself invested in the story. It's because there was no story. And that's exactly what kept happening. As I told you, all I did was tell us. It was like, so this is how I got to where I was, but it didn't give us any scene. The only scene in this beginning interlude or prelude was when she learned she had cancer. So she interrupts her monologue about how she got from a beginning photographer to an established photographer by saying that she was on a beach and this couple had walked by. The wife, who just happens to be a phenomenal doctor of sorts, is like, have you seen that mark on your back? Have you gotten that checked out? Because I think that's cancer. Hopefully that does happen in real life, where if somebody sees something abnormal, they say something. Probably not, but whatever. This is the book. This is Nicholas Sparks. I'll give it some grace. And then we commence on another how many chapters of monologue. We get to Maggie as a teenager, and that was when I said, finally, I'm gonna get some story. And it didn't take long for me to realize there was still not any story. It was just me talking to you, not creating any kind of picture, not giving you any insight, like not putting you in the scene. Actually, I'm probably a lot more descriptive and storytellerish than Nicholas Sparks was in this entire novel. Not only did I have these issues, but the narration was atrocious. First off, I get that Maggie is dying. The thing about her is she doesn't have a good relationship with her family, which another pin, okay? Now that she knows her cancer is back and that it's terminal, she has decided not to tell her family until after Christmas because she doesn't want to ruin future Christmases with this news. I don't really know how quickly cancer progresses, but I don't think she dies for another 5 or 6 months. However, this present timeline takes place over the course of essentially a night. And she is so weak by the end of this night in which she's telling Mark her story that you think she's gonna die right then and there. I don't think it would have sounded like that if I'd read it, but the narrator made her sound so frail and so incapable of doing anything that I was like, is she gonna die right now? Then we go from deathbed Maggie to I'm 15, but I sound like an 8-year-old Maggie. It was really, really difficult to listen to her because I didn't feel like she had any sort of maturity. That's compounded by the fact that the writing gave no development, except for the fact that she got better at her schoolwork. I don't know how she developed as a person. I felt like she was basically the same person going into it as she was going out of it, except maybe she had a different outlook on love? Maybe more of appreciation for her aunt? I just don't know how she grew. I really don't, because even in terms of her family, I didn't understand their dynamic at all. She had this very cliched, stereotypical relationship. She had an older sister and then her parents. And of course, her parents didn't love her. And not only did they not love her, but they preferred her sister because her sister was perfect. We get to the end and we find out the sister, well, she always thought that their parents preferred Maggie. I'm like, did we really just go there? Did we really just go there? We did. If you hadn't caught on, we did. It's established early on she doesn't have a close relationship with her family. I could understand her parents being embarrassed or ashamed that their daughter got pregnant as a teenager. But does that mean they wouldn't even visit her for Thanksgiving or Christmas? Maybe one factor was the finances. I didn't think they were as poor as they seem to have been. Another spoiler, we learn that Bryce dies in the end. And that was kind of the only good part of the novel. Although, because of the lack of storytelling, there was a lack of connection for me. Even though we all knew that Maggie did like Bryce and just didn't want to admit it, there was no chemistry. There was no connection that made me root for them to get together. And so by the end, while I was sad that Bryce died, I was like, who cares? It made no sense because she has the baby. She doesn't even go back to her aunt's house, but directly from the hospital, she goes back to Seattle. So she never even says goodbye to Bryce. At some point, she writes him, I think it was a Christmas card. Maybe it was that same year. Maybe it was like a year or two later. And then that's how they communicate. It's only by a yearly Christmas card. And this, here's another spoiler, this is after he had proposed to her. They claim to be in love. Obviously, they're not mad at each other, but they only communicate once a year. they agree that what they're gonna do is once she finishes college or turns 24, they'll meet back up at Ocracoke at the beach where they shared their first kiss. And we all know that's not going to happen because he ends up dying. He goes into the army and he dies over in Iraq. I don't really get that either, except that Nicholas Sparks just wanted to draw things out. I was sad for him, and I was sad for them because they never got that connection, like they never got their resolution. But at the same time, I was like, they didn't deserve a resolution. They didn't have a relationship. She likes him. She won't admit it. They do a really, really slow burn friendship to lovers. They go on like 2 pseudo dates. Then they have 2 real dates. He kisses her and then he proposes to her. And she's like, first off, no. Second off, no. We're not ready for this. I don't want to keep this baby. I don't want to stop you from pursuing your dreams. What from any of this makes me want them to be together, except that Sparks is giving us that expectation that they should be together. And we know me. I don't do romance. So the fact that they don't end up together doesn't break my heart. Like, I enjoy the fact that this is like an alternate romance that, particularly for a Nicholas Sparks book, actually not particularly because a lot of his end in tragedy, like the girl and the guy don't end up together. There's always a problem that tears them apart. But in his formula, they tend to have at least one period of time of bliss, right? Of happiness. In this one, they never had that. Okay, so he kissed her. So they both claim to be in love with each other, which, do I need to go into that soapbox again? Please tell me no. And then at the end, we're just supposed to care that he dies. Like, I care because he's a person. He didn't need to die. But I don't care because he's her romantic interest. Let's go back to the beginning, which is how Maggie gets pregnant. Thankfully, Sparks eventually expands on the scenario. But for me, I thought even after he goes into it with a little more detail, it was really hard to swallow the explanation. Maggie essentially is curious enough about sex to do it. But at the same time, she's ambivalent enough that, like, it's not something she's actually thought about doing. I don't understand. Like, for me, curiosity comes from a desire. You want to know about something, therefore you explore it. Like, that's curiosity leads to exploration. Her curiosity didn't actually happen until they were doing it. I don't have a problem with the fact that he was a jerk and that you didn't know him and that this was gonna go nowhere. I had a problem with your motivation. I had a problem with the motivation of everybody in this novel. I wanted more lead up to their encounter. There's this convoluted story about how they know each other, but it's all in passing. He's just super hot. Like, essentially she sleeps with him because he's hot and he talks to her. I could understand if she was in the midst of her sexual awakening, but she was not. Anyways, he's dating this girl, and then the next thing she knows, they've broken up. She runs into him at this house that they're both hanging out at. And they're just like sitting on a swing and they're talking, and then he's like, yeah, let's kiss, and then let's go to my car and have unprotected sex for your first time. I thought there could have been a lot more involved in that, like thoughts in her head, questions about what's going on. But you know what? You can't actually have that stuff if there's no scene. So maybe that's why it happened the way it did. After she learns that she's pregnant, she gets his number. And I think all of this must have taken place over the summer because she went to Ocracoke rather than going to her school, and she didn't give birth until around May. So by the time she finds out, he's already back in California. And she gives him a call, and she already knew that he got back with his girlfriend. Like, basically the next day, she saw him with the girl. And so she calls him, and he is so mean to her that she doesn't tell him that she's pregnant. Yeah. So he's a jerk, but he's a one-dimensional jerk. Like, he's not a real person. Nicholas Sparks just wanted to throw someone in there to do what he needed to have done without flushing him out, which is the name of the game. And so as I was saying about the narrator and about Maggie's lack of development, she has this bear that she calls Maggie Bear. I guess it's supposed to be a juxtaposition of her youth and her burgeoning adolescence and growth. To me, it just looked like she was a child who needed her teddy bear the entire time. And then this was how Mark revealed that he was her son, because he gave her a Christmas present. And what do you think was in there? Maggie Bear. Because she insisted on bringing it to the hospital because she's a child. She's a child. Like, no matter what Nicholas Sparks is trying to make us think, she is still a child. And not in a good way, in a bad way, in a way that I'm like, why did I even listen to her story? She says the only thing she wanted at the hospital was Maggie Bear. Yet, just decides to let her newborn son have this bear, even though she didn't want to hold him, even though she had no connection to him whatsoever throughout the entire novel, with one exception, which is when she was on her second date with Bryce and the baby kicked. You meet Bryce because Aunt Linda is an ex-nun. And actually, let me segue here because I know I'm going to forget this little pin. Aunt Linda was a nun with another woman. I think her name is Grace. And they decided to leave the nunnery together. The whole book, you kind of wonder if there is more to their relationship than just friendship. It is addressed between Bryce and Maggie, and the conclusion is we don't really know. We don't think so, but we don't really know. It kind of bothered me, particularly because of their religion, which is Catholicism, which is why we're going off on this tangent right now, because it all has to do with them going to church. So isn't there this huge problem in the church? Like, not only is that against Catholicism, homosexuality, why are we making this huge deal about them being nuns and them being religious, and then insinuating that there might be more to their relationship and this is why they left the nunhood, when they're still relatively devout? Not even relatively, they're still extremely devout. Not only that, but then we get so much of Grace. But does Grace ever actually talk? I don't think so. She plays this huge role in Aunt Linda's life and subsequently in Maggie's life because, you know what she is? She's a midwife. And since Ocracoke is the literal middle of nowhere, it takes an hour and a half to get to the mainland by ferry. Who do the people depend on for their baby birthing but Grace? And I don't mind Grace in theory, but in actuality, she plays no part in this story. Like, I don't see the need to mention her over and over and over and over. Like, why? Everything Linda does, Grace is a part of. They're in business together. Anytime they go anywhere, they're together. I'm like, I get the best friend thing, except now you've planted the seed as to, are they friends or are they more than friends? And if you want to go that route, nothing even happens between them. So what's the point? What's the point? Maggie meets Bryce because they're on the ferry back from the mainland, because in order for them to go to Mass, it's an all-day affair because of when the ferry leaves, like comes and leaves for Ocracoke. So she's just in the back of this car sleeping. She decides to get up, and then she sees this man on the boat, and the man is having his dog throw away his trash, and we go from there. And Bryce is... Bryce. We're gonna tangent again. We're gonna pick up that little Bryce pin. Bryce is part of the most perfect family in the entire world, which actually extends to every character in this novel. None of them are flawed. Even if you want to consider Maggie getting pregnant at 15 a flaw, she is not flawed. Even if you want to consider the fact that she is really bad at school and doesn't care, she's not flawed because basically none of this is her fault. Like, she doesn't do anything wrong with any of this. These are just things that happen along the way. Anywho, Bryce, his mother was accepted to MIT at age 16. His dad was one of the highest ranked cadets at West Point. His brothers, who are Richard and something else that starts with an R, are 12, and they are certified geniuses. Well, technically, they're not certified. They're assumed to be geniuses, which is proven later on when they have graduated from, I think, MIT, some really hoity-toity, maybe Harvard, some Ivy League school at the age of 16. So the mother got accepted at 16. Their brothers graduated at 16. And then Bryce, so he is able to tutor Maggie because he's equally, if not as smart, even though everyone likes to bemoan the fact that he's not as smart as his brothers. But he was homeschooled by his mother, and so he's already graduated and been accepted to West Point by the age of 17. And correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't there like prerequisites to get into West Point? Not just grades and things, but you have to have like a prep school to get in? Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there was a few research stones left unturned there. So then he is not only extremely smart, and he improves her grades drastically because he's a genius, but he is the sweetest, most thoughtful, most capable, ripped, attractive guy on the planet. And I know this is Nicholas Sparks. I do. I expect nothing less from him. Except I guess I expect more from his agent and his editor and his publisher to be like, dude, where are the character flaws? Where are the things that make him human? Where are the things that make any of them human? This feels like a first-time writer. Someone who had nobody checking over their plot, nobody checking over continuity, nobody saying, these characters don't feel real. Oh, hey, like, you started this, but you didn't finish this. Or, where's my scene? Like, quit telling me what's happening and show me what's happening. Put me in the scene. Let me feel it. The only emotion I felt was boredom. I mean, actually, maybe the other emotion I felt was disgust. Yeah, and pain. Oh my gosh, there was a lot of pain. Although, as I said, there was a twinge of sadness when I learned Bryce died, but that was quickly overshadowed by the fact that I didn't care. Which reminds me, talking about Bryce's perfection, what do you think happened? He goes off to West Point and he's accepted into this elite program. At some point then, he is sent overseas, which is where he dies. That's not a part of the story that I think needed to be expanded on because it wasn't part of the story. But it was kind of the most interesting aspect of the story. I would rather know more about what Bryce was doing than what Maggie is doing. The pregnancy thing, I'm going to tie it into Mark as Maggie's unborn baby, or Maggie's baby, because he's obviously born. So one thing I did like was the fact that you expected the baby to be a girl. My question, my naturally suspicious mind, was wondering if we were going to be introduced to this baby at some point. At some point, this baby was going to come back to us. Which is how I then started wondering, maybe it's not a girl. Because my first thought of Mark was he is this Christian dude who wants to go into the ministry. He has already been accepted to seminary. He is in a serious relationship with someone that he wants to marry. However, there's got to be some level of intrigue and interest here. So maybe this night that they have is gonna lead to something it shouldn't. And then I was like, you know what? I don't think it is. But there has to be a point to all of it. Plus, Maggie, when we first are introduced to her, is telling us how she has a YouTube channel. Sorry, I'm laughing because really it started as a documentation of her work and travels. But that makes me laugh because traveling's expensive, people. And while she has success now, you still don't get the sense that she is wildly successful and incredibly rich. And it turns out the gallery that she works at isn't her gallery. It's this guy named Trinity's. So he's a success and he lets her work there. And yes, she can showcase a few select pieces. So I'm laughing because of the implausibility of her travels. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could not figure out how she was affording her lifestyle. But then it goes back to her YouTube channel. Once she learned she had cancer, took off because she started including cancer videos, which I liked at first because I thought it was going to be a bit more important. And the only thing it led to was, yes, I have cancer and I will die from it. I didn't feel like he fleshed that out enough. Of course, when she dies, I had a little twinge inside of me because I'm not super callous, guys. I wanted him to develop this so that I didn't want her to die. We learned that Mark applied for a position at the gallery because he had watched her YouTube channel. And her first instinct was to say, no, I don't want a fan to work at the gallery. After all the other applicants, so he applied before they even started broadcasting that they were going to hire. That memory was what made me say, Mark is something else. He's more than he seems. After all those applicants fail, they reach out to Mark and he comes. Like, this blog thing, is that really how it works? Because then it's like the more obsessed people became with her cancer journey, the more famous she became. And this is why they had to hire Mark, was because people started coming to the gallery in droves. And I was like, is that how it works? I'm like, is this kind of a story, something that draws people in like that? And if so, I wanted that. I wanted that from this book. Her pregnancy, like, she's completely detached from it the entire time. I don't even feel the pregnancy throughout the novel. The only thing that Sparks continued to do was remind us she was pregnant and give us very surface level concerns like, oh, I'm gaining weight and I have acne and I don't want anybody to know I'm pregnant. What bothers me about that is she made a choice. And these are the consequences of her choice. Granted, it all takes place in the mid-90s. So the view of teenage pregnancy was different. But it all goes back to characterization, where I felt like she never grew and accepted what she did. I got tired of her whining. I got tired of her complaining about the fact that she is embarrassed, essentially, about being pregnant and not wanting people to find out. Which brings me back to Bryce, because you know how I told you how perfect he is. And how in the mid-90s, public perception of teen pregnancy was very different. Guess who had it all figured out and was completely accepting of the situation? I really don't know many men, even today, who are like, you know what? I want a pregnant girlfriend. But yes, Bryce was like, it wasn't that hard to figure out. I'm like, you know what? I feel like it kind of was, because you never got the sense that she showed, because she had such a small waist. And towards the end, it was like, at what point in your pregnancy are you? I felt like you were really far along, yet then you were talking about how you didn't even need to get pregnancy pants yet. And then the next thing I know, you're having Braxton Hicks contractions, which I must have missed something because I had started skipping. But I was like, could you please say Braxton Hicks one more time? The first time was sufficient. After that, I understood your contractions were Braxton Hicks. I didn't need you to specify every single time you had a contraction that it was a Braxton Hicks. I got the message. She's convinced she's having a girl the entire time, and you can see Sparks trying to fool us because even when she has that baby, he never tells you. He never uses a pronoun. And it isn't until we get back to modern day Maggie that Mark is like, well, what did you have? Or maybe he didn't even ask that. It was more like, I think she said he, and he was like, oh, so you had a boy. You know what I'm saying? I wanted more of a bond between her and the baby. I can understand at first there's no connection to this being a person inside of you, especially when it's unwanted and unexpected. But after that first kick, I wanted to see Maggie question her decision making, to wonder maybe she wanted something else, or maybe to even think about the adoptive parents or think about this child's future. And we got none of that. My next pin, her schooling. I think my problem again is he comes in and he's this taskmaster. She's whiny. Literally, they have one session and she's all about doing her schoolwork after that. Not only does she catch up, she surpasses where she should be, even though she was super far behind. And then what we learn is that after she gets home, she is so depressed that she bombs everything, yet she basically keeps the B average. And I was just like, I wanted more of that as well. All you're telling me is that you're a terrible student and you don't care about school, and then all of a sudden you're turning everything around and you're such a genius that you can bomb everything and still pass, yet you've lost interest in school so much that you barely pass in the end, and then you go to community college and blah, 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 blah. I wanted to see more of that in her. This is my mantra. I wanted more. I wanted more development. I wanted more scene. Like, show me all this stuff. Stop telling me about it. Like, I want to be in there. It was so annoying. So boring. I have written down here her preparation to die. Honestly, I can't remember why I wrote that down. Put it in the comments. Remind me why I wanted to talk about that, and then maybe I'll answer it. But I want to wrap this up, so we're not going to dwell on that. The two other things I wanted to talk about were the title of The Wish, which I waited for us to get to, and we did not get to it till the very end of the book, which sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not. In this case, it was underwhelming, and so in the lead up to Mark's revelation, he asks her, if you could have one wish, what could it be? Or what would it be? And she said, I would go back to when Bryce was going to West Point, and I would move to DC. I would not have us plan to meet at a certain point. Like, I would change that. I would make sure that he doesn't do what he does so that he ends up where he ends up. And anyway, so I kept expecting the idea of the wish to be more pronounced, to have more of an effect on the novel, maybe even to the point where we get a little into the supernatural, the paranormal, where her wish is granted. Like, maybe we get some basic backstory, and then what Mark does is he's like, I can help you change that. And then we go essentially back in time so that she can fix her mistakes. I thought maybe that might be where we go. Except that's not really a Nicholas Sparks thing. He just kind of kept pulling out of her what her wishes would be until he essentially had to hand feed it to her. And he's like, well, what about your baby? So then eventually she was like, yeah, that was my wish, or that would be my wish, to know that he was okay, to have held him, or something. Something really cliche. And then he's like, here's your present. Oh, I'm your son. The last thing is the formatting of this novel. Actually, no. So I have two more things. I know I said I have two, but then I just remembered something I wanted to talk about. So I'll talk about the new thing first, since I have the old thing written down. The new thing is, as I have hammered into you, this book is all tell. There's no substance. And one thing I wish I had gotten was a sense of place and setting. I wanted a clear distinction between the now and the then. But the now and the then both felt like they took place in the same time period. I wanted to feel the 90s more. I was alive during the 90s. It was grunge. There was My So-Called Life. There was MTV. There was, in many ways, a simpler time. There were no phones. We didn't have televisions everywhere. We didn't have DVDs. We had VHS. And we only got bits and pieces of that kind of a life. And so I think it could have helped the novel a whole lot more to get that sense of time and place. And it reminded me of Tamara Ireland Stone's Time After Time and Time Between Us. This guy who can travel back in time to certain places. And what happens is he goes back to the 90s for X reason, and he meets a girl. You get the juxtaposition of him in his time and then him in her time. It truly felt like you were in the 90s. You felt like you were part of it. That it was a different time and place rather than just like a relocation. I wanted that feeling, that nostalgia from 90s Maggie, from 15-year-old Maggie, and I didn't really get any of that. There was passing mentions of things, and so that's just one more reason that I feel like Sparks threw this one in. Like he didn't try hard with this novel, and nobody pointed out any of these problems because he's Nicholas Sparks. I mean, is anybody gonna tell Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, oh, you could do better? Probably not. And he's the king of cheesy romance, right? So last thing is the way that Sparks introed the book, which was with present day Maggie. When we went from present day to the 90s, for the longest time, I felt like the story would have been better suited if we didn't have that little intro. I mean, if you're thinking about it visually, as a TV show or as a movie, guy walks into a bar to meet with his long lost flame, or, you know, someone from his past, and he's like, let me tell you a story, and then we do the wavy thing and we go back to the past and we get to live that out with him. You know what? I wish I didn't have that. Like, could I have started with the problem rather than going through all the junk of what present day Maggie is going through? I eventually realized once we hit present day Maggie the second and the third time, that wasn't quite feasible. Like we needed the setup of present day Maggie so that we could come back full circle to see what happened to the kid, to the baby. But I still think it could have been done so much better. I thought that what we saw with present day Maggie could have had more emotion and relevance. It felt like Sparks said, okay, I've had enough of this. Now I need a little bit of a cliffhanger, so I'm gonna come back to present day Maggie, only to give them crap they don't care about, so I can go back to the crap they do care about, and then I can end on a one note. This book was an absolute failure, and I do not know why people like it. I don't know why it brought them to tears, because it evoked no emotion from me. Here you go. See you later. Have a better day than I just did. Bye.